Hi, and welcome to Living and Learning. I'm Karen Kugel, your host, and today we have back, by popular demand, we have Doug Cook, our guest, our expert on housing and development, to dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues of community development. We know that it's important in our country today. We have such diverse communities all across the country, and Doug has worked both well, in many communities around the country and even locally. So we're going to hear from him again. In the last talk, he gave us a really excellent summary of what was going on in housing and community development over the last, well, close to 100 years, I guess. And he's going to give us a short synopsis of that again, and then we're going to talk about some community development projects, some of which he's had some hands-on involvement in locally and other ones around the country. I think Kansas City is one of the places he mentioned. So we're going to get right to that. So Doug, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you again, Karen. So I think we'll start by taking a look at Figure 1, actually. So what we're going to actually talk about in a great summary of what we talked about last time to sort of conclude is where have we gone from the early days of settlement houses and public housing and so forth. I'd say three major factors: the privatization of affordable housing, and also the 3 Ps in general. Private-public partnerships are operative in everywhere. No longer is anything done just only by the public sector or the private sector. And finally, there's this sense of if a development is occurring or being redeveloped, integrating it into the neighborhood, integrating it into the community. You can no longer think of something in isolation. So take a look at Figure 1, and if you remember we were talking about public housing, one of the things we can sort of do to conclude where public housing is nowadays is also privatization. Over the last 15 years, a lot of activity has happened in that arena, starting with a program called Hope 6, now called Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, and also Choice Neighborhoods. And as the last label says, Choice Neighborhoods, again, it's that sense of developments are not isolated. They have to be integrated into the community, into the neighborhood, into the marketplace.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes.
I just want to make sure for our audience that you were talking about national programs, or how are these are not just in Massachusetts?
Oh, no,
in other
we're
words.
talking about national programs.
Okay, all right. Just
national
want to clarify
programs,
that.
but we do have in Figure 1
Yep.
a local representation. Cambridge Housing Authority has actually worked hard in improving its housing stock through the rental demonstration program. And the rental demonstration program is the conversion of housing. In some cases, the Public Housing Authority may still own it. In other cases, they may actually sell a portion of it or joint venture a redevelopment of it with a private developer. And then the rental assistance no longer comes through a public housing program, but it comes through Section 8. So there's actual Section 8 certificates, vouchers, contracts actually implemented directly to the community and to the residents.
Another question about Section 8. To define that, Section 8 is a clause within the Housing Authority?
With the housing.
Just for those people who may not know.
It's actually within the Housing Act, you're right.
Ah, okay.
And it refers to rental assistance. Essentially, the government provides rental assistance to the tenants who live in designated affordable housing.
Right. And I know that you discussed this in the last one. We talked about where the metrics are or the levels are for affordable housing versus we talked about workforce housing. Can you just go over that again for our audience?
Okay. Yes, we talked about what the income targeting
Right,
was,
exactly.
more or less. The low-income housing tax credit program has to be built for households that earn at or below at least 60% of area median income. And in the Boston area median income is around $107,000. For a family of 4, 60% of area median income is about $64,000.
I see.
So anything over that, they would not be income eligible.
Okay,
for a
I'm sorry
family
for that
farm.
interruption.
No,
I just
no,
want to clarify
no,
that
no.
for the audience.
Very good, very good. So again, back to figure 1, it shows Jackson Gardens, which has had, actually I picked this up on the HUD website. It has tremendous improvement, and actually they
That looks
worked.
great.
Yeah, they worked hard in a program called Curb Appeal, and you may have a problem with the clarity of the photo when your folks look at this, but I've been there up close, and it does look completely renovated. It's a really nice looking development, and Cambridge Housing Authority has converted 9 of its developments to this public-private program.
That's great.
And so just again, to summarize and pull it together, if you look at figure 2, you'll see 2 buildings with garages facing you, and these are actually 2 and 3 bedroom cottages, and these are low-income housing tax credit developments in Kansas
they're
City,
nice.
Kansas. And
Yeah.
this is the transition.
Really
If
nice.
we think about what public housing used to look like, this is what we now see. And in fact, I'm involved, my company's called Advisory Affiliates. I'm a principal.
Advisory affiliate.
Advisory Affiliates. And I do development consulting, I do investor consulting. In this case, I'm actually doing investment consulting, development consulting also for a developer who's a friend of mine. And we've worked very hard. There's 4 developments in this little community that he's going to be involved in. And this is Buchanan's Crossing, and we're involved in Buchanan's Crossing 3 and a new development called Davidson's Landing, which is a tax credit development. And Buchanan's Crossing 3 is going to look like this, but it's going to be workforce housing. So in that case,
Workforce housing.
it's
Yep.
going to be available for residents earning up to 100% of area median income,
I see.
essentially market rate.
Right.
So we see the transition. This sort of announces the difference between what public housing or affordable housing used to be and now what it is now. And we talked about mixed income housing. Within our own development here, this own community is going to have a variety of residents across the income spectrum.
And how many, just out of curiosity, how many units are part of this development, or are there limits to how big a development can be?
That's a loaded question, and I
Oh,
won't
yeah.
go into the finite aspect of that in our business. It really depends on feasibility.
Okay.
There's 2 kinds of.
To the community?
Yeah,
you mean,
well,
to
in the low-income
town?
housing tax credit program, there's 2 kind of developments. They're called allocated, and those you apply for, and then there's the tax-exempt bond program. And in a survey of these developments across the country, the bond program, you actually can build a little larger units because you're not as it's not as regulated, it's not as restricted in terms of the type of units you have to build, and you also can build more market rate units, for instance, traditionally. So the average size of an allocated development is about 60 units per development.
Sizable.
And the average size is about 129 for a bond finance development. And we have bond finance development. The Davidson's Landing development I told you about is going to be 116 units. That's larger. The combined phase 1 and 2 is 24 units of the tax credit development for Buchanan's Landing. The workforce housing development is about 16 units.
I see. So, and pardon my ignorance on this, but the bonds that you're talking about for funding the projects, are these just municipal bonds, or can they be statewide, or
No,
a combination,
they're-
or what are they?
It's
Yeah.
again, we're getting into the nuances
Oh,
of
sorry.
financing, but that's okay. No, it's tax-exempt bonds. They can be allocated by certain agencies and authorities.
Oh, I see.
But within the housing program itself, the Housing Finance Agency is involved in allocating a bond inducement for the development. Then you usually get the bonds from the Housing Finance Agency, and then there's private investment in those bonds.
I see. So
Yes.
incentives, in other words.
Yes.
Okay, you're calling them inducements, but they're
Yes.
incentives for them
Yeah.
to invest and to get
Yes.
involved. I see, great. Super, okay.
And they also get an allocation of tax credits through that. So it's a two-pronged thing.
Two-way thing,
Yeah,
right.
the
So it helps the community, and they get some
Yeah, the
tax
inducement is actually
forgiveness.
a technical term about allowing the bond to be allocated,
I see.
however you raise the capital.
I see. Okay. So were there more things that you wanted to bring us up to date on with the history of community development, or shall I get right into the question that intrigues everybody on gentrification?
Let's talk about gentrification.
Okay, good. All right. So where are we today in this hot topic of gentrification? There are people who are very excited about it. There are people who feel a little bit moved out of the way because of it. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Can you talk to us about that and how how community development plays a role in that?
Right, right. Well, I guess the term sort of got invented in the late 70s, early 80s, when we started to see a back to city movement and development occurring in areas that were formerly disinvested in, and lower income people were pushed out. But let's start with a technical definition.
Okay.
The Brookings Institute states it this way, and I will read this just to make sure I get it correct, since I'm quoting the Brookings Institute. The process by which higher income households replace lower income residents of a neighborhood, changing the essential character and flavor of that neighborhood. So there's the two components, incomes and also character and flavor. And the usual cause is there's a change in preferences in a neighborhood. People in the metro area all of a sudden have found, for some certain reason, this neighborhood is attractive. Maybe there's some new jobs in the area. Maybe there are some community improvement that's happened.
Or new subway stop or something like that.
New subway stop or something like that. Also, there could be a lack of supply, which is what it's really one of the diseases in the Boston area. We're starting to build now, thanks to Mayor Walsh in Boston and politicians and leaders across the Commonwealth. We're building a lot more than we have in a while. But we have a restricted, city size is restricted. There's limited land available. And when there's a restricted supply and all of a sudden you have 10, 20, 30, 40 new households come in, or that job situation changes, it has to displace someone because you don't have that area to grow. And we're also restricted in terms of how fast we can build because of land use restrictions in our community, and because of people like me on the planning or community development side. We want to have a say on everything, so it takes a while. Also, the unequal investment. In our last session, we talked about redlining a bit, where banks prior to the 60s would actually, in concert with the federal government, actually not allow insurance or mortgages to go into certain areas, low-income areas. So that was actual, de facto.
On the books.
Yeah, that de jure, actually, by law on the books. But then you have also de facto, in fact, unequal investment. A certain area will have investment and another area won't.
But that's changed.
That's changing, yes. So what's positive about gentrification? If you happen to be a low-income house owner, your property values are going to rise. We've had that happen in communities that I've been involved in investing. People are afraid about getting displaced when they are renters. If you're a homeowner, you still may not want to be displaced. Your taxes may go up, or your property may all of a sudden be the sore property on the block or something. So you have that impact. That's usually positive. Another one is what we talked about before, mixed income communities. Mixed income communities socially are more beneficial. We found that school districts that are mixed income definitely have better scores for the students. It's one of the reasons why we're trying to have not to have affordable housing go out into the suburbs where there are better schools, for instance. And also, on the negative side, displacement, obviously, disintegration of the social infrastructure. We talked in the first session about urban renewal, where in the older developments, think about the West End in Boston, if people have an historical perspective there, very dense housing, contiguous, and in some cases dilapidated, as people defined, but social cohesion, families took care of each other and so forth. Obviously, gentrification will, as you start to pull low-income residents out, their support system changes from the families that they were trusting before. The other thing is, and again, getting to educational, which I know is an area of your expertise.
Near and dear to my heart.
Yes, yes. I think it was a study in Atlanta. I can't actually state completely what the study stated, but essentially it said in some lower income neighborhoods, households have had to change schools so often that it's disruptive to the student.
Absolutely.
Obviously, having,
Yes.
especially in elementary and middle school years, very disruptive to the student. So if students are displaced, and then that in some cases perpetuates some of the problems that lower income people have with educational attainment. But development without gentrification can occur and can be promoted. Again, I'm melding my planning and development fields. On the planning side, there's been a lot of effort in sort of understanding the nature of it, data analysis. And there's big data out there and there's small data. Big data in terms of understanding what's happened in terms of changes in income levels, actually identifying blocks where there's been impact, blocks where there hasn't been impact, blocks where there's more home ownership, so you can find a way to sustain the community without having displacement.
Excuse me, when you refer to blocks, are you literally
blocks,
referring to,
blocks.
you are referring to
Blocks,
specifically blocks, not
blocks.
just areas? Okay.
Blocks,
All right,
yes.
thank you.
And I said big data and soft data, doing community surveys.
Yeah,
Door
how
to
do you
door,
do that? Yeah.
going door to door, having community meetings, putting signs up, and very often this could be people who are protesting change in their neighborhood. We've studied that as a planners. What comes about sometimes there initially is a reaction that we have to stop displacement, which may mean in some communities they've wanted to bring back rent control. And that could be an entire show. We could talk about that for an entire day.
That's very interesting, actually.
Short term, it may stop displacement, but obviously if you're an investor, or maybe if you're a homeowner, even a low-income owner that has a duplex, and you're dependent on that second unit for subsidizing you, and all of a sudden now there's a cap on the rent.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you may have limitations.
So the effects are tied into so many other
Yes.
things. It's very complicated. Yeah.
Exactly. You may have that duplex example. You may want to refinance in order to do improvements to the unit.
Right.
If you can't raise the rents, you might not refinance. So it's a lot more nuanced, but that may be a stopgap. And then think about the kind of development that you may want to have occur. So now if you want to take a look at Figure 3, I can actually talk about Figure 3. We're going to look at Figure 3, Figure 4, and Figure 5 together to discuss gentrification. But on Figure 3, a class was given at the National Planning Conference for APA in 2018 on harnessing gentrification's momentum towards social impact. Now, when I talk about Figure 4, it's actually totally separate. It has nothing to do with this class, but it did happen in West Philadelphia. So if you look at the graphic on the map there, you see I've isolated a little bit of where West Philadelphia is located. We're going to talk about that in Figure 4 for the development that I'm going to classify and talk about in West Philadelphia.
Okay.
And if you look at that map, the colors, essentially gray and white, indicates limited gentrification. The darker colors show gentrification, and you can see it's happening in West Philadelphia. So again, that big data, what has happened, 23,000 units were lost of units that had rents lower than $750 a month.
huge.
That is significant. Yeah. That's not just in West Philadelphia. That was in Philadelphia, by the way.
I see.
Gentrifying neighborhoods, they found in this study, had lost low-cost units 5 times faster than non-gentrifying units. And the Housing Authority had a waiting list of 62,000 units. So if the Housing Authority, for instance, was going to be involved in reinvestment, it's not a place where you can put people who are displaced easily. So if we flip to Figure 4, we can see the solution.
I see.
And this is the solution. This was not all part of the same program. This is not part of the same class. It was actually another APA class that was taught, and I was involved in actually creating the class, and someone worked with me from an organization called Community Development Trust, and they were going to describe a private-public partnership. They were involved in West Philadelphia. So you see the map there, and if you can see the orange outline, that's defining West Philadelphia. The dots on the map represent the 1,100 units of quality, affordable housing that were redeveloped through CDT's efforts with the neighborhood restoration of West Philadelphia.
So that's about half of the displacement.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And if you can tell, when we flip over to figure 5, these are not large developments. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 unit developments. So it's a neighborhood with low density housing. And what happened?
Which is desirable.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Significant investment, and the investment had public-private partnerships. It had different levels of funding. Friends and families were involved in some of the areas of the redevelopment. A tax credit investor was replaced by high net worth individuals in some of the developments. There was a tax credit syndicator, the financial intermediary we talked about in the last session involved, and a mission-driven CDFI, Community Development Finance Institution. So there was a blending of public-private monies as well as...
How many people are we, I mean, how many organizations are we talking about? There must have been so many.
Just to give you an
Right?
example, in Massachusetts, when we close a low-income housing tax credit deal, very often there's 5, 6, 7, 8 sources of financing.
Amazing.
And there may be as many...
Yeah, no idea.
There may be 3 or 4 developers. There may be a nonprofit developer, 2 joint venture partners. They may bring in a partner who's a money partner. And one of the things we talked about was private-public partnerships. And in terms of the evolution, we really see a lot of trust goes into that framework, a lot of trust and faith that if we have a problem and we get the right people together, we can solve that problem. And that's really changed from back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s when you thought only government was going to do it. The impact in this area, again, to get to the solution of gentrification, we had more family-sized units were produced than were before. There were a lot of carved-up housing units, so you'd have 6 units in a essentially a single family, and they made it into a duplex. More deep affordability. More people at the 50%, about 50% of them were deep affordability. In some sense, replacing those units that were lost, that were rented at $750 and less. Again, more stability for the residents. We talked about the school-aged children. Children can actually know that the elementary school they go to, when they're in kindergarten, they may go to right through 5th grade.
And they could walk to it.
And they can walk to it in a lot of
Exactly,
cases.
yeah.
That's the advantages of an urban neighborhood.
Right.
So again, this is a development, but we've come a long way. In a lot of cases, we talked earlier about the whole community visioning process, which can be melded with a developer. So developers may spend time seeking residents that want to participate, may become stakeholders and may want to become leaders in an effort to see revitalization in their neighborhood. But having those neighbors involved also means they will want to see less displacement, no displacement.
Right.
So see that the development helps the community.
Yeah, over the long term.
Right, right.
So with all these different stakeholders, right, who's in charge of sort of making sure that everyone is satisfied with the outcomes and sees it all along? Who does that?
Well, in the low-income housing tax, if the low-income housing tax credit's involved, the primary developer will be responsible.
Primary developer,
There will,
okay.
within the tax credit, there will be something called a land use restriction. And if they have certain units designated for very low-income people, for handicapped people, that has to continue. You have the regulatory authority, the Housing Finance Agency, will do compliance audits to make sure that continues. Now that's on that technical standpoint, but if the city's involved, the city would be responsible also for monitoring. The developer will also, if the city had promised infrastructure, rebuilding of sidewalks and roads.
Cable TV?
Yes. You won't just have
Yeah.
the renter in property, on the property on 13 Roseview Street complaining to City Hall. You'll have the developer complaining to City Hall,
I see.
who made a significant investment.
I see. So that's how they take care of the stakeholders and the various moving parts in the project. Are there other things that you want to show us, some graphs or some charts that give us a better or another illustration of what you're talking about within community development?
Yes. So just on figure 5, we just show in West Philadelphia, the before and after picture. But, one of the things we talked about is development, the community visioning process, mega developments.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about that.
Right. In Boston, actually, the Globe had an article, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, or earlier, maybe over the weekend, that profiled 9 developments that are under construction now, $7 billion worth of development.
Wow.
Thousands of multifamily units, hundreds of thousands of commercial space, very integrated into the community. And so on figure 6, you will see an example of that, and that's happening in the Fenway right now. It's called
Fenway again.
Yes, the Fenway. Circle right back to
Yeah.
where I had my start. Fenway
right.
Center, as an example of a mega long-term plan development. It's been 15 years.
Wow.
And
Incredible.
remember we talked earlier about the limitations on land? This is done on air rights over the Pike.
Amazing.
Very, close to
Very
Fenway
exciting.
Park, very close to the Yawkey Way.
Even catch a game.
Yes.
Possibly.
Yes. And one of the buildings you could probably overlook
There you
when
go.
it gets built because it's
Wow.
high rises. So there's going to be 500 apartments there and some affordable apartments as part of that development, over 100,000 square feet of commercial space. But again, it represents that integration of the neighborhood. So it actually extends somewhat into the back bay because it crosses over the Pike, and then it goes into the Fenway. Obviously, it had to be involved in integrating the train stop and so forth, and a lot of community visioning had to occur there. It took
Absolutely.
the developer 15 years to get to this point,
That's amazing.
but it's under development now.
So I'm going to have you just give a quick little synopsis of the kinds of, because this is all very exciting, and we talked about it in the first episode about the different components that you would need to take into account to do a good job and be successful in this career path. If you could just kind of, again, list some of the areas that your career touches upon. And it's not to say that everyone has to be an expert in all of them, but how different people can even get into this field. If maybe they don't have a background in it, but how could they? And then, leave us with one final take-home message about the whole thing. Okay.
Well, I mentioned in the last session, multidisciplined. People who are involved in architects, for instance, are involved in the built environment. Maybe they're studying to be architects, but they want to get a little more into development. Or as a planner, you might want to get more into understanding design, so you take courses in architecture. It's a continual sort of education process. You have to have that base of understanding economics, statistics, policy, politics,
Community
development, sociology, society. You have to be able to analyze that. And you have to have a little bit of understanding of sciences. So even as an appraiser, for instance, you have to know how to review an environmental study, which means you might have to know a little bit about chemicals,
Right.
and how they impact. It doesn't mean you're an expert, and you're not going to profess to be an expert, but you have to know the definitions.
As our problems in Michigan, for example, the water and all of
Exactly.
that. Or I was thinking, we talked before the show, you were talking about the involvement of social workers in some of the community development to look at the impact on
Right.
education and families. So that's another area that people might not think about, but it's certainly important.
Exactly. Good point. And quickly, we'll digress. Maybe this is a concluding point. In affordable housing is no longer just housing. We have resident services coordinators and certain resident services, and the resident services coordinators very often have a background in social work.
Awesome.
So they may be doing work on the educational side, they may be doing work with young people, they may be doing work with elderly people, bringing health services to them and so forth. So there's a whole range from the working on the community impact side, working on understanding how the community impact on one side and how individual people actually are impacted. What's the health and welfare of individuals and the health and welfare of communities.
That's great. So when I drive by these complexes as they're being built, I feel a lot more confident that the various stakeholders and people in the community are having their voices heard, frankly, from this discussion. So I'm happy about that.
That's where we are now.
Yeah,
that's great. Where we are now.
So
it's not a top-up, top-down process anymore.
That's so good to hear. Any other parting thoughts for us, Doug?
No. I'd say, we continue to find ways to optimize public resources and private investment. And that's the future. We triple bottom line.
Right.
It has to have a social impact, it has to have an environmental impact, and it has to be financially feasible.
Right. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming and sharing all this wonderful information with us. And as I said, it makes me feel so much more comfortable now when I drive around and see these construction projects that are impacting my parking in certain areas, but I see now that it makes a difference for everyone. So, so thank you. Thank you again, audience, for tuning in to us, and we hope you learned a lot about housing and community development. Very, very dynamic field, and maybe you'll be interested in getting involved in it someday. Thanks.